is the Banner Baseball Show. Paul Mancano and Danielle Allentuck on a Friday in December. Talk about the Orioles off season. Danielle, the holiday season is not going to stop us from talking to Orioles baseball. How were your holidays?
It's been good. I'm at my parents' house on the other side of Maryland, soaking up some family time. How's yours?
Nice. I mean, it's better than the Orioles, dropping some kind of roster move on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, like they did. I think it was 2 years ago. They did the James McCann move either on
Mm-hmm.
Christmas Eve or the day before Christmas Eve. And it just,
It was December 23rd.
there we go, day before. So it just throws everything asunder. You're cooking, you're wrapping presents, and then they decide to make a roster move right at the last minute. This was a quiet Christmas for baseball. I don't think I saw any big roster moves happen on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. It was, I mean, the NBA and the NFL decide to play all their games on Christmas Day, but besides that, for baseball, they decide to take the Christmas off, which was very nice.
I mean, there were a lot of moves last week. It kind of felt like everybody was trying to squeeze everything in before the holidays. But, it was nice to see
True.
agents and executives maybe actually take a day to be with their family. So
Right.
good for the sport.
Good for the sport. Very nice of them.
And good
We are
for
going to,
us.
and most importantly, good for us who cover the sport.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about a roster move that the Orioles made, not a massive one that will, carry too many headlines, but one that could impact the team significantly in 2025. And then we'll also talk about some guys who could be in line for extensions and why this might be the offseason for the Orioles to try to extend their young guys. Danielle, let's start with the Orioles bringing back an old bullpen friend, Matt Bowman, 33-year-old, coming back on a minor league deal. He's a local guy from Chevy Chase. If you may recall, the Orioles picked him up in August after he had kind of a rocky season. Didn't spend any time with the Rockies, but spent time with just about every other team. Started his 2024 season, signed by Minnesota in January, then traded to Arizona for cash in May, then DFA'd, then signed with Seattle, then DFA'd, then signed with Minnesota, released in August, and then the Orioles picked him up, and that's where he really found his footing, was in Baltimore.
Yeah, I thought this was a good deal for the Orioles. A minor league signing with an invite to spring training. With their current roster construction, I do probably expect him to make the team out of spring training. He's not a lights out guy anymore. He's a very consistent guy, though. He can be an innings eater. He can go out there and be your setup man. He's got that veteran aspect to him. So I do think that this was, pretty low stakes deal. He may not make it through the full season, and that's kind of okay for the Orioles. They probably have some guys coming back from injury midseason. But I thought this was a good pickup for them. Reliable guy. You can stick in your bullpen, and you just know who he is at this point.
Yeah. In 15 2/3 innings last year in Baltimore, 3.45 ERA, struck out 14, walked 6. I mean, you saw enough of him in that small sample size to think that he could come back and be a good player in your bullpen, at least to start the season. Like you said, the Orioles like to mix and match in their bullpen. They just don't have too many sure things right now. After they decided not to pick up Danny Coulombe's option, they're looking at a bullpen right now. You have Felix Bautista, you have Sir Anthony Dominguez, you have Gregory Soto, CNL Perez, Yennier Cano. I think those five are as close to locks as you can get. But beyond that, it's just going to be kind of a hodgepodge right now. You can throw Matt Bowman into a mix that now includes, Keegan Aiken, who's got one option left. He was solid for them last year. Brian Baker. Then you've got some guys who could be starters, could be relievers, depending on how the Orioles see them. And Cade Povich and Trevor Rogers and Chase McDermott. So this is not a finished bullpen, and that's okay because we're not even into January yet. But bringing back Matt Bowman, I think, is a fine deal because you saw enough of him last year where you feel like maybe he can contribute.
And I would argue that Aiken is probably a lock as well. They like
Sure.
him. They like what he did last year. He was very reliable for them. And I would probably think that some of these younger starters, Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, at least to start the season, I would think they would want them to stay as starters, even if that means that they're starting in Norfolk, just so that they have that depth, to pull from if they have starter injuries like we saw from last year. But especially with Chase McDermott, I could see him being a bullpen guy by the end of the year. So they have some things to play around
Yeah.
with this bullpen. I still think that they could probably use a big signing to kind of anchor the bullpen or a trade or some sorts like that. But they at least have enough guys to start the season right now.
Yeah. And then once you get into the second half of the season, and hopefully you get guys like Kyle Bradish and Tyler Wells back, I mean, Bradish obviously would fit back into that rotation. That probably wouldn't come until maybe August or September, but that would bump a guy to the bullpen, maybe somebody like Albert Suarez. And it's always easier to have a guy start spring training, start the season as a starter, and then work him into the bullpen. Look at DL Hall a few years ago as an example of somebody that the Orioles tried that with. Rare is the pitcher that is Albert Suarez, who can bounce back and forth between the rotation and the bullpen without really experiencing much fatigue. The Orioles are very careful, especially about these young guys. So somebody, like you said, like Chase McDermott or Cade Povich, or even Trevor Rogers, I would imagine that the Orioles will try to keep them a starter for as long as possible. But then if they get into a battle for the division in September and they need another arm, they'll say, hey, Chase, come on up. We'll have you throw some high impact innings. Maybe you make the postseason roster and you're pitching out of the bullpen. That is the kind of scenario I could see them used in. But this Orioles bullpen, as currently constructed, I do think still could use another upgrade, maybe another major league signing or maybe a trade, because right now feeling just a little bit unfinished.
I do also wonder if the bullpen's the type of thing where, okay, they'll go out and get like a Danny Coulomb from a cash trade or
Right.
pick somebody off a waiver to start the season. And then at the midway deadline, go out and get somebody, a higher name guy to kind of anchor the bullpen. Once they see, how Felix comes back from his injury and where Tyler Wells and Kyle Bradish at, is Tyler Wells a consideration for that bullpen? Once they kind of have an idea of where things are standing midway, I wouldn't expect them to necessarily make a big bullpen move now leading into the season, but I could really see them in July kind of figuring out what they need and how their construction is looking, and then going out and getting that guy.
Exactly like they did last year. The two guys
Mhm.
that we're talking about starting out being locks in this bullpen, Gregory Soto and Sir Anthony Dominguez were deadline acquisitions, and they
Mhm.
ended up being pretty impactful for this team. All right, let's talk extensions, because Danielle, there's still a lot of guys out there in free agency that the Orioles could add, and we don't yet know what kind of offseason what kind of money this Orioles ownership is ready to spend in their first offseason under the David Rubenstein era. However, we did get a clue, at least we think, from super agent Scott Boras when he was talking with the Baltimore media for the press conference of Tyler O'Neill, one of his clients. And he was asked about what it's like dealing with this new ownership group. And he specifically mentioned the fact that this ownership group is trying to keep the guys that they drafted in-house, the guys that have blossomed into stars under their watch, which implies that guys like Adley Rutschman, Gunnar, Henderson could be in line for extensions if the Orioles are able to get something done with them. I know it feels, Danielle, like a long shot, because until we see Rubenstein and company spend the kind of money that many fans are hoping that they'll spend, we can't predict that they will. But you never know. Something could come out of the blue, something that we haven't heard about. And all of a sudden, Adley Rutschman is locked up for years to come, because that's more of a priority to ownership than perhaps going out and re-signing Corbin Burns or signing a big-time free agent.
And you never know, but I don't really believe it's going to happen. I'm very much of the
You're just
way.
here to rain on everybody's parade.
Well, I think until they do something, you can't say that this is how new ownership is going to
Sure.
be. They've never outright said, we want to go out and extend our young guys, or we want to go out and sign Corbin Burns. Those words have never come out of their mouths, and we
Yeah.
haven't seen any action in either of those directions to kind of actually think that new ownership is going to prioritize that. So we know that they have to spend money. They've said that, but they haven't actually really gone out and done that yet. So until they do that, I'm a little skeptical that anything, even an extension, is going to happen this offseason.
That's fair. I think Orioles fans are definitely approaching this offseason. A lot of them are saying re-signing Corbin Burns should be priority number one. I think that a lot of them saw, the Tyler O'Neill edition. They kind of gave up hope on re-signing Anthony Santander, which is, I think a rational decision, because he's definitely going to walk somewhere else in free agency. But I think a lot of fans are saying the top priority should be extending Corbin Burns. But if the Orioles were to re-sign, were to extend somebody like Adley Rutschman or maybe even Gunnar Henderson, that to me would be as big a win as re-signing Corbin Burns. They'd still have to do something to address their starting rotation, but that would be a big time sign that this Orioles ownership is ready to spend, that they are at least have, a bigger checkbook than the previous ownership. and you're keeping somebody in-house that you drafted and developed. You are
Mhm.
showing that you are going to reward the guys who have come up through your system and performed well for you. So to me, that would almost be a bigger win than re-signing Corbin Burns, is having the ability to bring back somebody that you drafted and developed into a star and is a homegrown talent that is already in your organization.
Yeah, I mean, they could follow the Braves, they don't
Right.
necessarily go out and sign the biggest guys, but they keep the talent that they've developed and that the talent that they've acquired through trades, and that's how they built up their team throughout the years. You have to remember that the Orioles have a lot of Scott Boras guys. Gunnar Henderson is a Scott Boras guy. He was asked directly about the possibility of extending Gunnar Henderson at winter meetings, and he kind of played it off like he always does, as for some players, that's the right move. And he was asked, well, is Gunnar one of those players where signing an extension is the right move? And he was like, he's a special guy who, he's going to get to free agency earlier in life than most people will. He'll be 27, I believe, when he's a free agent.
Yep.
So he will garner a big contract, and he's probably not a guy who would be willing to sign an extension, because I still don't even think we've seen the best from Gunnar yet,
Yeah.
especially defensively. I think he still has a long way to go defensively, and that he's going to be worth even more, especially if he's still playing shortstop in 4 years. But a guy like Adley, who is coming off kind of a downer season, he's already had basically 3 full major league seasons. I think we know who Adley is at this point. You know, we know what his assets are. We know what he looks like when he struggles, and I think now is a good time for the Orioles to capitalize on signing an extension with him. Because he is a little bit vulnerable. He is coming off a down year. I mean, he may be a little bit cheaper because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's start with Adley because, like you said, not a Scott Boras guy. Scott Boras, the reason that we delineate Scott Boras guys and not Scott Boras guys is Boras loves his guys to hit free agency because they set the market, a la Juan Soto. If Juan Soto had signed the extension that the Nationals had offered him 3 years ago, he would be sitting there with a $450 million contract instead of a $765 million contract. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes guys get hurt in their last few years under team control, and then they're not worth as much in free agency. But Boras is almost never. I can't imagine he really ever would advise a client to take a contract extension that is sitting on the table. He'd rather them get to free agency. So Adley Rutschman might be a little bit more open to an extension than somebody like Gunnar Henderson. He turns 27 in February. He's got 3 years of service time left, so he would be a free agent after the 2027 season. And like you said, coming off a season where he showed some beige flags. I wouldn't say red flags, but some beige flags. The second half of the season was not his best. His WAR has gone down each of the last 2 years after he debuted in 2022 with a 5.4 Baseball Reference WAR, put up 4.3 in 2023, and then 3.4 last year. Danielle, though, if you're Mike Elias and you're looking at Adley Rutschman, if you still believe in who he is as a player and as a person, does the second half of 2024 season, does his downward trajectory there, does that change who you believe he is? And does that change your overall outlook of the player? Or do you say, we believe he's going to get back to where he was before, and we believe he's going to be productive for years to come?
Well, I think it doesn't change. I think that seeing how he reacted to those struggles was probably a good thing for Elias and Hyde and the rest of the front office to kind of see, okay, this is what he looks like when he's not his best. Like, let's say that second half of the season is the worst he's going to be. Is the
Right.
worst Adley Rutschman still worth extending for a long period of time? And I think that's kind of the debate that they would have to have. If that's who he is now, is that still worth extending? And I think the answer is probably yes, because you know that he still has the flashes and you know what his potential is. But I do think that everybody believes that he is going to get back to who he is. So if you, and in a couple of years, if he has another bad half season, you already know what it's going to look like. So I think that is kind of valuable information for the Orioles to kind of weigh as they kind of consider what an extension would look like. And you also have to remember with a guy like him and all these other pre and current arbitration guys, is the first couple of years are just going to cover what their expected arbitration would be. So it may not be the largest contract because I don't remember what his projection contract was for next year, what trade rumors said it was, but say it's $5 million. So next year it would just cover the $5 million. It wouldn't be like he'd be getting paid $10 million next year. So it would still be the same amount for those 3 years. It would just be adding on like an additional 3 years of $10 million or whatever it is. It'd be a
Yeah.
lot more than $10 million, but So it's just a way of, can they lock him up at a cheaper price for those later years based off the information they have now? So I think of anybody, Adley is probably the guy you should try to extend because he's coming off that last year. He's going to be a little bit more affordable, and catcher who is a switch hitter is extremely valuable. Obviously, we've seen that throughout his whole career. It's why they drafted him first overall. So I just think that the assets that he has, even if the second half of last season, if that is who he is, it's still worth extending, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's well said. I think the factors that complicate this are the fact that he is a catcher, but just because we see a lot of catchers once they hit 30, their production really starts to dip because it's such a demanding, such a grueling position. The Orioles try to be as careful as they can to keep him on his feet and to keep him fresh. He plays about 150 some games. That's a lot for a catcher, but a lot of that, about 25% of that, is him as a designated hitter. So they really do try to give him a lot of time off his feet, or at least not on his knees behind the plate. And the other factor to consider here is the presence of one Samuel Basallo, who is just 20 years old. After the Orioles signed Gary Sanchez, I think we, saw that and said the Orioles plan to keep Basallo in AAA for at least the majority of the season. Maybe he gets a September call up and gets his feet wet, but he's probably not going to be your backup catcher this year. But down the line, he is projected to be an impact bat. He's projected to be, the Orioles say good things about his defense, even though his defense is slightly behind his bat. During winter meetings, all the people that we talked to, Anthony Villa, Kobe Perez, they all spoke highly of the defense, of the improvements that they've seen from him behind the plate. So you have a superstar catcher potentially waiting in the wings. Do you really want to extend the catcher that you already have into his mid to late 30s if you already have Samuel Basallo? What do you think about that, Danielle?
Well, I would do mid-30s, because I think Adley, even if his catching skills regress, or I mean, even if his bat regresses, his catching skills are going to stay the same. So I
Sure.
still think that he's valuable, and you can say all you want about Samuel Basallo. It's going to take him a couple of years to get adjusted. If you just look at the trend of the other prospects, I mean, how Gunnar Henderson came up, Colton Cowser, Jackson Holliday last year. These guys aren't guys who necessarily contribute right away. So even if he gets called up at the end of the season, maybe even 2026, he's not going to be ready to contribute right away. And there's nothing wrong with having two catchers who split time. It's not common practice, but there's nothing wrong with that. He could even be a trade chip, along the way if they need to.
Right.
It'd be a pretty significant one, and they probably don't want to do that. But if Adley's doing well and they have him under contract for a long time, you could trade Samuel Basallo eventually. We still don't even know how Samuel Basallo's catching skills are going to progress. He may just end up being a DH or maybe even a first baseman. So I don't think that's necessarily a gamble that you have to take at this point.
Yeah. And like you said, that bat is so good.
Mhm.
There's a potential you could put him at first base. You could have him at DH a good amount of games. Ryan Mountcastle only has a couple more years under contract. Maybe first base is the long-term spot for him. Or like you said, maybe they do a pretty even split of 162 behind the plate, 81 and 81. And that allows them to stay fresher. That allows them to play deeper into their careers. Having Adley and Basallo aren't necessarily mutually exclusive if you know how to play them. And injuries are going to happen. So you could always see one guy getting more playing time than the other because somebody goes down. So yeah, it's just a fascinating way to look at this. And in terms of what it would take, the looking at what kind of contract projection, it's difficult to project contract extensions, but the one that the Dodgers signed with catcher Will Smith a year ago, I think is an interesting kind of baseline because Will Smith signed a 10-year, $140 million contract extension that takes him through the 2033 season. And when you're talking about a 10-year contract extension for Adley, that would take him through the age 37 season. So that's a little bit longer. But the interesting thing with that contract is with Will Smith is it also includes a lot of deferred money. So perhaps that's a way that the Orioles ownership could go as well. Let's talk about Gunnar Henderson before Danielle loses her voice entirely, because I think it is kind of in some ways, it feels like a moot conversation because it's very, very difficult to imagine Gunnar Henderson and Scott Boras agreeing to a long-term contract extension. He turns 24 in June. He's going to be entering his age 28 season when he hits free agency. John Miolio of the BaltimoreBanner.com wrote about how he thinks the Orioles may have already missed their window for a Gunnar extension, even if there was a window to be had, because Gunnar just had 9.1 WAR, according to Baseball Reference. He had 37 homers. He plays excellent defense at shortstop. He finished 4th in MVP voting. He's a legitimate superstar. And I went around at winter meetings in Dallas and asked a bunch of media members if they thought that Gunnar would be the first billion-dollar player. I got a lot of no's, but that's because Gunnar is going to be slightly older than Juan Soto is when Juan Soto got his $765 million contract from the Mets. And also, Juan Soto is already a below-average defensive player, whereas Gunnar Henderson is an excellent defensive player. And the bat is something that is going to carry a player longer into his career. Gunnar's value, a lot of that comes from his ability at shortstop and his speed. So if those skills decline, and those skills decline faster than a bat typically, if those skills decline when he gets into his mid to late 30s, teams are probably going to have a less valuable player on their hand than just DH Juan Soto, who's going to slug for them. However, all that said, Gunnar Henderson is going to get a ton of money, Danielle, in free agency. And the longer he waits, the closer he gets to free agency, the higher that price tag seems to go up.
Yeah, they're not extending him. I don't think he would accept it. I don't think they would ever offer him enough money for him to be worth it to accept it. Just to be frank, it's not worth his time. I mean, I think he's only going to get better. We know what he can do at the plate. I think he can probably be a home run leader one day in this league. At least, top 3. I think he was number 5 or 6 this year. I think his defense, as I said earlier, is only going to keep getting better. And so what if he's on a shortstop forever? If he can play second or third base every day, that's still extremely valuable. It's a lot more valuable than some of these other guys you see getting these long-term deals. Because like you said, Juan Soto is probably going to end up as a DH.
Right.
It's going to be a very expensive DH. And Gunnar Henderson is going to be able to offer you, top production at plate and also daily defense. So
Yeah.
I think that it would be in his best interest to wait a couple of years and just hit free agency and see what he can get. I think he'd probably be, the top of his class when he gets there.
Yeah, I mean, Bobby Witt Jr.'s contract extension with KC, I think, gave a lot of fans hope because he's in a similar spot. Both of those guys are probably going to be near the top of MVP voting for the next 5 years, probably 10 years. He signed his deal. Bobby Witt did 11 years, $288 million with an option to get to 14 years, $377 million. I think they're just different players and they're different guys who are going to approach free agency a different way. I think from everything I've heard, and I haven't covered Bobby Witt Jr. personally, but from everything I've heard from people who do, is he's a very understated guy. He's a quiet guy. He just wants to get this done and out of the way. He's not as focused on setting the market, on cashing in as late as possible into his career. And I think that Gunnar Henderson, just because he's represented by Scott Boras, it's just going to be a different approach to free agency. Maybe there is some way, but like you said, Danielle, it's very, very difficult to see the Orioles getting something done. A couple other guys that we should mention. Grayson Rodriguez just turned 25 years old. The deals for pitchers are harder to nail down because pitchers have more devastating injuries. They have stuff like Tommy John surgery. Teams are less willing to pay them into their mid to late 30s than they would be for a position player. Coming off a season which he had a 3.86 ERA, 10 Ks per 9, but injuries. I mean, lat injury, kept him out for the final month and a half, 2 months of the season. He's still so far away from spring or from free agency, I should say, that it's difficult to know exactly what his value is going to be when he hits free agency. The Orioles think that he can be an ace, but unlike Gunnar Henderson, who's already finished in the top 5 in MVP voting, Grayson Rodriguez is not yet there, but he could be one day. It's just the Orioles probably don't want to take that risk now when they don't yet know entirely whether Grayson Rodriguez can be that ace. And same with Kyle Bradish, who's a little bit older. Kyle Bradish was a top 5 Cy Young finisher a year ago, but had Tommy John surgery. We don't yet know what he's going to look like when he comes back. He turns 29 in September, so he's going to be even older when he hits free agency. So it's tough to see an extension getting done with either of those guys right now.
And I think that the injuries are really the factor there.
Yeah.
Grayson, we haven't seen a full major league season from yet. And, of course, 2023 wasn't because of injuries. It was because of poor performance. But last year, he was on the injured list twice. And although they were relatively minor, they did take him out for the postseason and a good chunk of May as well. So I just think that having an injury history already this early in his career, it's just that much riskier, especially with how widespread Tommy John injuries are. His shoulder injury from last year was pretty similar to the one he had in the minors leagues in 2022. So I just think that history, maybe it makes him cheaper and it's less of a gamble, but I just think that you have a lot to weigh there until you see him actually acting like that ace that they think he can be.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Danielle, I'll let you get out of here. You need to go drink some tea, take some Mucinex, do whatever you need to do to get yourself ready for the new year, because hopefully the Orioles will have some moves that we have to talk about soon, and I need you to have your voice for that when you eventually, heal up and the Orioles do make those moves. I'm also going to talk to Yuri Karasawa, who is a contributor at JapanBall.com, an awesome person to talk to when you talk about players coming from Japan, because he has great insight there. We're going to talk about the Orioles' new free agent edition. Let's get into it. And we're joined now on the Banner Baseball Show by Yuri Karasawa, who does awesome stuff. You may know him as the Yakyu Cosmopolitan on Twitter. Also has a phenomenal YouTube channel that he runs entirely by himself. Also a contributor at JapanBall.com. And honestly, Yuri, when the Orioles made the signing of Tomoyuki Sugano, there was about a day or two where I thought, who would be good to talk about this? And I thought Yuri Karasawa would be awesome. And then I message you, I reach out to you. Then I go over to our good friend Locked On Orioles, Connor Newcomb, and I saw, yep, he already talked to you. But we're grateful that you're doing the rounds here to join all of the Baltimore media to talk about a pitcher that has dominated the MPB for a while, and that's Tomoyuki Sugano. So thanks so much for hopping on here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to be able to reach out to a new audience with you Baltimore fans and, talk to some people other than like Dodger and Yankee fans who are always like really interested in Japanese baseball. But hopefully we get some more Orioles fans on board talking about MPB as well.
Absolutely. Well, let's start there, because Sugano kind of was an unknown name to a lot of Orioles fans before they made their signing of him, before they signed him to that 1 year, $13 million deal. But he has been dominant for a long time over an MPB, 3-time MVP. But there was some concern coming into the 2024 season that perhaps injuries had caught up to him. Perhaps he was a little bit over the hill. What kind of career did he have over there to kind of put in perspective, just how successful of a pitcher he was with the Giants over there?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to compare him to like a Japanese version of Clayton Kershaw, just in terms of the resume, because this is, a highly touted prospect coming out of college. He wins the MVP in his second season. He goes on to win 2 more MVPs, 2 Sawamura Awards, which is basically the Cy Young equivalent in Japan. And yeah, I mean, he finishes his career here, or maybe he comes back later on, but, he finishes this portion of his MPB career as somewhere between like a top 10 to 15 MPB pitcher of all time, I would say, just in terms of the longevity he's shown, such a high floor, just, almost never having a mediocre season, always in that like very good to elite tier. And yeah, I mean, he had some injuries from 2021 to 2023, and it looked like he was kind of falling off, and like we were seeing the, final days of Tomoyuki Sugano, but then he finds that fountain of youth in 2024 and somehow wins the Central League MVP for the 3rd time again. So, yeah, I mean, I think he is feeling at 100% again, but of course, 35 years old. So, just how much does he have left in the tank? That's the question.
Absolutely. And it's a low risk deal for the Orioles. It's just the 1 year, $13 million. So assuming, it goes well, they have one great year of an aging star. And if it doesn't, 1 year deal, there are worse things to do. In terms of the process of signing him, it's a whole lot different from the process that he went through 4 years ago when he was posted in 2020. And he talked about that in his introductory press conference. And he said completely different, night and day between that process in this one. For fans who may not fully understand the process of posting a player and then the posting fee and everything that goes along with it, why was that process in 2020 that resulted in Tomoyuki Sugano not signing a contract? Why was that so different from the one that he just went through?
Yeah, so the posting system as it stands, the post Otani system, because Otani was the last player to come over under the old posting system, but essentially the MPB team has to agree to post a player, and then once they do, the player can negotiate with all 30 MLB teams, and then the fee that goes back to the MPB team is tied to the amount of money the player gets in that contract. It used to be a flat fee for the most part, but now it is like Yoshinobu Yamamoto makes 325 million, and then the Dodgers are getting back 50 million. So with Sugano getting posted in 2020, which was already rare, by the way, for the Yomiuri Giants to agree to this, in 2019 they broke that precedent that they had set for so many years of not posting guys with Shun Yamaguchi. But Sugano, he, the manager of the Giants at the time was his uncle, so he kind of had some, extra sway with the team, but he didn't get that deal that he was looking for, either financially or maybe in terms of the years. And he just decided to re-sign with the Giants for 4 years. And at that point, you're thinking, yeah, he's going to be 35 the next time he gets a chance. I mean, there's some opt-outs in there where he could have left, but it's like he just kind of gave up on his last chance to go to MLB, we thought. But, I think he really wanted to pitch on the MLB stage, and he still had that. He realized, I think, over the years that he still has that fire left in him. And now at 35, I just don't think that, he knows, like, with 100% certainty now, like, this is my absolute last chance. And, being 35, he doesn't have that many suitors who are giving him, multi-year offers. I'd be surprised if he had a single multi-year offer on the table. So it's mostly a matter of him choosing the team he wanted to go to, the environment he wanted to go to, surrounding himself with a cast where he can, perform to his highest level. And I think Baltimore is a great fit for him because, simply put, they're a winning team right now. And I think he needs to be on a contender right now because he doesn't have much time left. And so, like you said, low risk deal, 1 year deal is, never has any risk attached to it. 13 million for him as well, which is higher than he was getting in MPB. So it's a win-win for both sides.
Absolutely. Now, he is a very different pitcher than the one who was posted 4 years ago, but I like your comparison to Clayton Kershaw because Kershaw has still remained effective despite some injuries as he's gotten older because he's just changed the way that he pitches, and he simply flat out knows how to pitch. It feels like Sugano, who no longer has that blistering fastball that he once did, he knows how to pitch, and he's changed the way that he pitches as well. What have you noticed about how he's kind of changed his arsenal? We hear about a 6-pitch arsenal now, and the fastball not topping out at 92, but it not mattering because he's just that good. What is different about this version of Sugano?
Yeah, like you said, he knows how to pitch. He's a master sequencer. He just, paints the corners. He has great command. So, a lot like Kershaw, even as he ages, even as the stuff gets worse, this is a guy who's still been very effective. Of course, the four-seam fastball you would notice in the 2017 WBC, for instance, he could run it up to 95, 96 at times. Now he's basically never doing that. The highest you're going to see the fastball get up to in MPB was like 94. I do think you could see it go a little bit higher actually in Baltimore next year, just because he's not going to be asked to go like 7-8 innings every time out. So you could see that go back up to 95, but still he's going to be mostly 90 to 92. So he's been able to introduce, more cutters and sinkers to keep guys off that four seam. The slider and the cutter tunnel is especially well against righties. He can kind of backdoor it to lefties, but you see it most against righties. A lot of curveballs against lefties. And I still think the slider and splitter are his two best pitches. The slider has, more sweeping action to it. The splitter, it's not on the level of, guys like Roki Sasaki or Yoshinobu Yamamoto, but it's still a great ground ball weapon for him, and it can get some whiffs. So, this is a guy that's going to be mixing speeds, managing his splits very well. This year in MPB, it was a sub 600 OPS against versus both righties and lefties. And of course, he's going to be able to throws strikes, really on any of his 6 pitches. So it's only a matter of being able to limit the damage on pitches inside the zone, limit the home runs, and I think you're going to see him have actual, pretty good success.
Yeah, and Orioles have done well with guys who don't necessarily need to strike out a whole lot of batters in order to be successful. Corbin Burns, his strikeout rates declined last year. Didn't matter. He was still one of the best pitchers in the American League. And with that wall being moved back, I know it's coming back in a little bit in 2025, but somebody who can succeed with the ground balls, somebody like Yennier Cano out of the Orioles bullpen could find a lot of success in Baltimore. Before we get you out of here, I do want to ask about Roki Sasaki because he still is out there and available for teams to sign, but he is obviously going through a very different process than the one that Sugano just went through. And when he was posted, the early chatter, of course, was, oh, he's going to go to the West Coast. He's going to go to the Dodgers and the Padres. Now, over the last week or so, we've seen reports about him meeting with some East Coast teams, the 2 New York teams and the Yankees and the Mets. What do you make of those reports, and what do you think maybe he could be looking for from a team? And if there's any shot that maybe a team like Baltimore could come out of nowhere and sign one of the best young pitchers available?
Yeah, so Roki Sasaki, the posting scenario for him is completely different because he's not 25 years old, which means he's subject to the international amateur bonus pool money instead of just like being able to make as much as someone of his caliber deserves, which is honestly upwards of 300 million. If he's on the open market right now with no restrictions put on him, he's probably a $400 million pitcher, if we're being honest. But he's not going to be making that. He's going to be making a couple $1 million actually. So this is an absolute steal for any team. And it has, his decision is completely dependent on things like geographic location, comfort level, pitching development, trust in the organization, things like that. It has really nothing to do with money at this point. I don't think that a couple $100,000 in one way or another is going to affect his decision, based on certain teams having more money available in the bonus pool when the calendar flips to 2025. So I think, when you see reports that like, oh, the White Sox are meeting with him and people are like, oh, why would he ever, want to go there? I think he's keeping all his options open. Like with the White Sox, for instance, he has the connection with Tadahito Iguchi used to play for the White Sox. And that was, the manager of the Marines when he got drafted. So like he has these connections all over. I do think the West Coast preference is, just default for most Japanese players. And, you see them being consolidated right now with the Dodgers and the Padres, and in the past teams like the Mariners. But as you see with Sugano, like for some players, they don't care one way or another. And they're just looking for the best fit in terms of the organization, the team. And like I said, if Roki Sasaki feels like his best chance to become the best pitcher in the world, which is his goal, is on a team like the Mets or the Orioles, then those are definitely, options for him. Now, do I think that's going to happen? Probably not. Like we are looking towards the Dodgers and the Padres. Like I think it's kind of a 50-50 race between those 2 teams, but I definitely wouldn't say that it's a done deal. Like you saw early on, the industry was like, oh, this is a done deal. 100% he's going to the Dodgers. I don't think it's like that at all.
It's just a fascinating option out there in free agency in a very different way to acquire a young superstar. Like you said, an absolute steal is just sitting out there. And I think the idea that the Orioles could even sniff at Roki Sasaki is just an exciting idea to think about. So I'm sure Orioles fans are dreaming of that. But in the meantime, they've got an aging superstar in Tomoyuki Sugano, who's coming over here on a 1-year, $13 million deal. Can't thank you enough, Yuri, for providing your insight. Where can people find you on YouTube, on social media, everywhere?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm Yakyu Cosmopolitan on YouTube, at Yakyu Cosmo on X/Twitter. I talk about, all sorts of MPB and Japanese players in MLB in English. And yeah, I'll be covering Sugano a lot in 2025. Again, Orioles fans, apart from Koji Uehara, Shintaro Fujinami, this is the first guy who's going to be putting on an Orioles uniform and being on the mound. So really exciting times. He's not going to, blow the world away, but I do think he's going to be able to show people that even at 35 years old, very capable pitcher. So looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Yuri Karasawa joining us here on the Banner Baseball Show. Like, rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. Subscribe to the Baltimore Banner, $1 for 6 months. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Paul Mancano, and we'll catch you next time.